Then let's get started.
Well then, hi everybody.
Yeah, please, you start.
Oh, okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Today is 12th of March. This is episode 8 of the Groovy Podcast with me, Peter Ledbrook.
And me, Ken Cousin.
Well, and Ken will be leading this one because I'm still recuperating from illness.
Yes, my condolences, my friend. This has been tough. We were hoping to have everything every 2 weeks, but from what I gathered last week, you were completely out of action.
Yeah.
That's a good answer.
Pretty much. I'm with Andres, so I should not go to the south of France ever again.
That's an awfully big price to pay, I'm afraid.
Oh, I don't know about that. I've very rarely been to the south of France. Not that it's not a nice place.
I hear. At any rate, the big news this week, of course, the big news of the last couple of weeks has been the move of Groovy to a foundation. So of the various choices, apparently they have chosen Apache.
Yeah, I'm kind of glad of that. I had really Apache in my head as possibly the most appropriate one. It's still got, I think, the biggest name recognition. It's got that heritage and history, and I know that the Groovy core team are a little they're reluctant with the changes to the infrastructure and everything else that will inevitably occur. But I think that's necessary step. That's necessary annoyance to go through. So. I expect it to do well within Apache. Hopefully they will go through the full incubator period, which is usually about a year, I think. Maybe it'll just be 6 months.
Well, hopefully it'll be streamlined. Guillaume Laforge did an interview on InfoQ, and we put that in the show notes, where it seemed like they were implying they were hoping they could streamline this entire process down to just 3 months or so. But that may have been the interviewer, Matt Rabel, that may have been his idea rather than the actual reality.
Yeah, well, I was involved with the Apache Shiro going into becoming part of Apache. And with that project, it's like, well established. It was a J-Security back then. So we're expecting a fast track. But to be honest, I don't think it's really necessary to be on a fast track. And it does take getting used to switching to something as formal as a foundation like that. So I think many projects go into it going, yeah, we're well established, we're going to fast track and what have you, but I don't think it happens very often. Maybe they can do it in 3 months, but I don't think it's that important that they suddenly become a top-level project straight away. And I think it does behove them to get that period of time just getting used to the way that Apache works.
So will that mean that they'll be moving to the Apache infrastructure as well, that they'll ultimately be groovy.apache.org, that sort of thing?
Yes, once they become a top-level project,
that
happens. They'll be in the incubator until then. But, they've got their own website already, and, most of the stuff that's visible to the public isn't tied to to Apache in any way. So it's sort of the Apache stuff is behind the scenes, so I don't think there's a need to rush to top-level project status.
I just wonder if people are going to start referring to it as Apache Groovy as well.
How often do you refer to Apache Maven? Maybe officially, or Ant for that matter. Yeah, I think possibly formally it will happen, like in certain written articles and that kind of thing, but I can't see it changing. It's been too long.
I hope not. I also actually hope that Groovy is an infusion of life into the Apache ecosystem as well, because while they have new projects that come along and things that get a lot of attention, things like Spark and stuff like that, Apache is not the destination that it once was, at least not from what I perceive as value. Of course, they do have the nice established situation, and it is a very good destination. I'm hoping that the addition of Groovy will be helpful for the Apache people as well as vice versa.
Yeah, fingers crossed that does happen. I feel, I don't know, I kind of feel that Apache seems better for established projects, but if you're completely new, um, the extra burdens there, the Apache name doesn't necessarily give you an awful lot. So when you're finding your feet, just having GitHub and a website, I think is enough, sufficient. So yeah, we'll see. I think it's definitely good for Groovy. We'll see, and yeah, hopefully it'll be interesting to see whether Groovy's picked up from the other Apache projects.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I'm sure that's going to be very helpful in the long run. I found it interesting that at the end of the interview, Guillaume was asked about the future of Grails, and they didn't say anything about the home for Grails or any destination on that. It basically made it sound like it was still all being decided. Have you heard anything on that side?
No, I haven't. So yeah, all I said is there's been no decision. I don't know how hard they're thinking about Grails joining a foundation. So it will just be an independent entity for the moment.
I mean, Grails is under a lot of flux at the moment, mostly because of the end of March deadline and the fact that they're trying to get out the 3.0 release before that happens. This morning I got the tweet that Grails 3.0.0.rc1, the release candidate 1, was available. Were you involved in that at all, or are you just aware of it?
I just saw the tweet this morning, just as you did, so nothing more than that. But it looks like they are on track, hopefully, to get a sort of final release end of March. I guess they can squeeze in an RC2.
Yeah, I don't know what the plans are, so we'll just wait and see. But certainly they're under very active development. I didn't notice anything as a major change between the M1 or what was it, the M2 version and RC1, but I haven't really looked through it yet. I did take a look at the link in the show notes is the one pointing to the release page. Let me just check that again.
Yeah,
yes.
I'm not expecting I'm not expecting sort of significant changes between the milestones and the RCs. I think it's really just bug fixes, sorting various things out, and also attempting to get as many core plugins as possible transferred to Grails 3, because that's going to be the biggest hurdle, I think, for many people when it comes to upgrading. So it's nice to see that there is an upgrade guide or a page in the Grails user guide for upgrading now.
Yes, exactly. I thought that was big news to come out of the M2 version, is that they now have a nice path in the documentation to the upgrade mechanism. And while that seems to be a lot more work for the plugin developers, it doesn't look like it's going to be that hard for people who are already accustomed to using Grails applications.
Yeah, certainly. I think people that aren't familiar with Gradle may find it a little harder, because a lot of the stuff is just moved to the build.gradle file now, and if you're not familiar with that, you will need to become familiar with it.
But that's a good thing. I mean, first of all, just moving to Gradle in the first place is a lot of goodness, and secondly, Gradle, of course, seems to be practically taking over the industry anyway. It's the default build tool of choice, and it's about time.
I'm not criticizing that decision at all. It's just that is a potential stumbling block for some. But yeah, most of it is about moving files around to new paces. It's nice to see like the plugin descriptor file move out of the root directory. I always thought that was a little bit awkward, to say the least. It made for an interesting build system to actually handle having a source file in the root of the project.
Right. But I think that's a good. The point I'm making is that by moving to the Gradle build system and having some people having to go through the learning curve on that, that's at least a learning curve that will be valuable because they'll be able to take the information they learn about Gradle and apply it all over the place.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, as opposed to learning Gantt, right?
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And again, yeah, actually, if you've been using any of the Gantt stuff, the custom scripts and the like, that will be a big hurdle as far as the upgrade goes.
Mm-hmm. And it's not like Gantt was ever, I never thought it was a bad thing. I thought it was nicely done. It just, again, Gradle kind of has become the de facto build tool throughout the industry. It's a good thing to leverage, and of course it has all kinds of power associated with it, and it's still under active development. So that's always a nice thing there. I just don't want to make it sound like, oh, I didn't like Gantt at all. I didn't really have anything against it. I like, Gradle's a really good move.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it wasn't, and I never really considered Gantt to be the issue. It was that we were creating a build system on top of Gantt.
Right.
And we didn't really have the experience and knowledge to do a really good job of it. So it's nice to offload that to the people that really know about building stuff.
Now, one of the comments that I always heard about Grails, when we were talking about, people were sometimes reluctant to adopt Grails because they knew it was going to undergo a major change when the new version number, 3.0. I found out a couple things about that. First of all, of course, the big change that seemed to be happening under the hood was the move to a Spring Boot-based infrastructure. And that, as it turns out, at least from my perspective, is a lot more discussion than it is anything that changes your day-to-day operations. I mean, I've actually spent some time with Spring Boot lately, trying to get a feel for what that's all about. And it's just an auto-configuration mechanism. It's just saying, hey, if these beans are in your class path, then you don't have to write a lot of configuration. You just get the benefit automatically. Or if you just ask for certain things in the Gradle build file, we'll wire them all together. It doesn't seem like it's changing anything from a fundamentally Spring Hibernate-based architecture, if you will, so that it's not as radical a change in practice as it seemed to be in the early discussions. Does that seem reasonable to you?
I think so. I mean, partly because Spring Boot brought a part of what made Grails good, the convention over configuration of a lot of things that the plugins were doing, for example, and bringing that into sort of Spring itself, a core Spring project. And they're just using a different technique, using annotations, but it's something that Grails was already doing, and now Grails can just leverage what Spring Boot is doing and basically take that off the Grails development team's plate. That's now something else somebody can do. Because Grails had to do a lot of work in order to get Spring to do all of that, to auto-configure Spring. Spring was not designed for that. It was designed for people creating their own XML configuration files to declare beans and the like.
Well, I know Craig Walls pretty well, and I'm sure he would have a bird at that. I mean, yes, they still have the XML configuration files, but they've got the component scanning, the annotations. They've got the Java config, which they're very happy with. But yes, you're right. It's all Java, and therefore it's all compile time and everything. Right.
Well, my point is that's where it started.
Right.
That it was manual configuration, and actual runtime configuration of the application context wasn't really designed for. That's what Spring Boot has kind of added as part of the Spring. I think, Grails influence changes to the internal design of Spring to make it easier to do this dynamic configuration. But as I understand it, it wasn't sort of fundamental to the design of Spring in the first place.
Right.
That's not how people expected it to be used. And that, that's the way things happen.
Well, the move to Spring Boot in general, the Spring Boot people are very happy because it seems to be revitalizing Spring in the marketplace. Spring was starting to get a bit of a reputation as kind of dated and large and unwieldy and all of that, and this is streamlining it and making it somewhat practical again. A lot of the people I know who talk to me about Spring are all asking about Spring Boot, and it's less of a dramatic change than it sounds like. And of course, if Grails still works with that, that's a good thing. It's almost like Grails is now a DSL on top of Spring Boot to some degree. as opposed to just being on top of Spring.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can understand. It was a little bit like that with when you first come to Grails and just having like Hibernate and everything else just set up for you with some defaults and just throw some files in this directory and voila, stuff happens. It feels like a small thing, this whole auto configuration, but it just improves the developer workflow significantly. It becomes much less intimidating a framework because Spring is kind of just plain Spring is kind of intimidating. There is so much to it.
Yes, I always refer to it. I always refer to it as a Swiss Army chainsaw. It's not just a Swiss Army knife. It's so massive and powerful it can do everything. But yeah, it just seems to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, of course, we should probably move on because we're going to have tons of things to talk about with Grails over the next couple of weeks. Because we know there'll be additional releases there. So what's going on outside of that? Of course, one of the things that was amazing after all these years is that the Spock framework finally went 1.0.
I know. I was scanning the show notes, and then suddenly it registered. I was like, "What? Spock has got 1.0? Oh my god!" Yeah, it felt like it was never going to happen. So, congrats to Peter and everybody else involved in getting that out as a 1.0. I think that will help boost adoption of Spock in a big way. Well,
I remember how long we waited for Gradle to finally go 1.0. Remember, that seemed to take forever. And yet Spock, I think it must have been 4 years. I mean, it was at 0.7-Groovy-whatever forever. I mean, now, one interesting thing is you may have noticed in the Spock 1.0 situation is that now Spock still has a supported Groovy version on top of the Spock version as well. So you can include 1.0-Groovy 2.0, 2.1, 2.2, 2. Actually, I think there's one missing, but they have up to 2.4. When you put in your...
I thought that was just the Groovy 2.0.
Groovy 2.0 works with them all. I mean, I've been using it for years and haven't had a problem. But if you put Groovy 2.4 in your build file, then you can also put in Spock 1.0-Groovy-2.4, and I suppose it's compiled under that or optimized under that or affected.
Okay, I see.
Yes, if you look at the web page, again, if you go to spockframework.org, it redirects you to the Google Code page, but then if you go to the GitHub page, then they describe all this, and they show they have multiple versions. And if I open that up for a moment here, it's different, because it used to be that you didn't have to go to all the different versions. You could just use 2.0 or what have you. Yeah, I went to the page now, and as they say, the latest release version is 1.0, but they say 1.0-Groovy 2.0, 2.3, and 2.4, all of those. And they recommend that you use the consistent one with the Groovy version that you happen to be on.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah. Now, go ahead, I'm sorry.
That's probably some more sort of small binary incompatibilities there.
Yeah, I expect it's a minor thing. I mean, as I say, I've been using the one that ends at -2.0, for years now and never had a problem with it. So I expect that that's simply, I'm arguing it's maybe an optimized version, but it'll be interesting if we get a response to this podcast that explains it. Which also, by the way, seems to be that Peter apparently has moved on from Gradleware. Did you notice that?
Oh, no, that's news.
I saw something about him being at Apple now, of all places. And I think it was a LinkedIn thing, although LinkedIn, you don't always know, that's always kind of a roll of the dice as to how accurate.
I hope you're not spreading rumors now, Ken.
Hey, this is a podcast. That's our job, right? So I'm wondering whether the release is connected with the fact that he finally actually had a moment to finish, because the whole time he was at Gradleware, they kept him. I mean, now if I had a developer the caliber of Peter available to me, I'd keep him busy too. But Gradleware kept him so flooded with Gradle-related work that apparently that was a big reason he wasn't able to finish up and release Spock. Because again, there's a whole lot of fundamentally new stuff in there, especially compared to the 0.7. It was mostly just finishing, getting it all done and ready.
Yeah, Yeah. And I think I'm guessing that Peter sort of came to a decision that all the things that he wanted in the 1.0 release weren't absolutely necessary. So that just the critical stuff would go in. Now we can call that 1.0.
Well, I do very much expect to hear from him as a result of this.
Probably. But I know I've been there before. You say I want these things in version 1.0, and then as time progresses, you eventually get to a point where you go, well, okay, that's not absolutely needed. You know, we can manage 1.0 without it and various other things. Because there was that whole period of Grills hitting 1.0, Gradle, you know, taking its time hitting 1.0, although it's the reason that took so long to get to 1.0 is fairly well known. It was about the realization that they had to basically implement the whole dependency management themselves.
Right.
And when they made that decision, that just ballooned the development time by several months. So,
which is fine, but yeah, quite understandable. Right.
Yeah. But it's kind of frustrating for all the people who are like, well, where's 1.0? What's going on? So.
Right. Now, all I did is I took my code from Making Java Groovy, you know, from my book, and I tried to take the Spock chapter and just change the build file to 1.0 Groovy 2.4, and everything worked as before. Now, I didn't try to use any of the new features. I was just upgrading an existing build to make sure everything worked, and so far everything I've upgraded has worked fine. I tried to run something. I looked at they apparently have also updated the Spock example project too, which I always use in presentations, you know, to explain to people what Spock is about. So that's now on Spock 1.0. I do recall having a minor issue with IntelliJ of trying to run as a JUnit test with 1.0 and getting some strange errors, but when I switched to a Gradle test, running it under Gradle, everything worked fine. That may have been me. I'll take a look at that, see if I see what the problem was, if maybe that'll go away.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed. But yeah, that was, I have to say that was the news that kind of, after scanning the show notes, was like, wow, yes, okay.
Right.
Unexpected, but great news nonetheless.
Now, speaking of releases, again, the other thing that was released, or another product, was Rat Pack is moving on again. Rat Pack is now up to 0.9.14 from what I gather.
Yeah, looks like they want to go for the lean approach and get those releases going as frequently as possible. Try to keep to that 2-week or 4-week schedule, like what we try with the podcast.
Rat Pack, I still get the feeling, changes significantly with each of these releases, or they may be aiming for a major point release at some point, but I get the sense that it will be significantly different from what we currently have when they actually do that. Of course, that's Dan Wood's writing his book problem, you know, as well.
Yeah, it's always fun writing to a moving target. But I'm not sure. I feel that a lot of the stuff is stable. It's just individual parts may see a fair few changes. But I don't know. This one looks more like fixes and the like.
What I'm really looking forward to... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the thing that kind of stood out to me was the switch to using Groovy 2.4.1, and partly because there are a lot of fixes to @compile static, the static compilation.
Oh,
and
okay.
I have found it quite interesting the way a lot of people have really taken to the static compilation supporting Groovy. You know, people were quite happy with using normal dynamic Groovy have just become big fans of the static compilation and supporting it and using it.
I have a future blog post that I'm going to have to write about that with definitely tongue-in-cheek as a defender of the dynamic typing rather than going to this static capability. I was planning to form an organization known as Grateful, which had to do with the Groovy Dynamic Typing Liberation Front, or Front of something French probably.
Yeah.
You know, with a character named something like Def Leopard or whatever, to defend dynamic typing in general. I really like it. Now, on the other hand, since I've been playing around with Cedric's Groovy for Android, they highly recommend you use compile static within any of the Android implementations, and so far I found that actually very helpful. So maybe I am jumping the gun too much, but I like the dynamic capabilities, so I try to resist this urge to prematurely optimize, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I like both, to be honest.
Mm.
That will always be the struggle, is knowing when it's best to use static compilation and when best to use dynamic Groovy. I will tend to just go dynamic Groovy unless I have a good reason to switch to static compilation. There's no doubt that at least the type checking is helpful for different types of project. I mean, particularly ones where you've got a lot of people working on them, and a lot of people will struggle with untyped APIs, and especially if you overdo the whole dynamic behavior thing.
Well, but you can always use type checked without using compile static.
Absolutely. In fact, when I do the Groovy course, I recommend, like, if you want to do it, use @type checked. Only use @compile static if you need that performance benefit, because there are those subtle differences in behavior.
It also reminds me of a discussion we had on Twitter a couple of years back, where they were deciding, do you use def for your variables, or do you use the actual static data type? And I was noting that in my own work, I tended to use the actual static type more and more, and only use def where I needed it, mostly because not only did it help the IDEs, but it also helped other readers, see what you're doing. Whereas a guy like Dave Klein, the author of Rails 2, a quick start guide, along with his son Ben, like to advocate in favor of retaining flexibility as late as possible. And that's where Dirk Koenig stepped in, our peripatetic lead author on Groovy in Action, and said, he says, if I'm coding and I think of a type, I type it, pun intended. So in other words, if he knows something's going to be a string or a date or an employee, he says string or date or employee. And if he doesn't know or he doesn't care, then he says def. And I've been adopting that as a philosophy ever since. I always thought that was very clever. Then when you throw on the fact that one of the nice features of compile static is you don't have to apply it to an entire class. You can put it on a single method. That means you can do all the dynamic coding you want and then profile it and find out where the problems are and apply compile static in very local ranges just to optimize what you need.
Yeah, but it's amazing how tough it is to persuade people that you should profile first.
And of course, that was Andres Almire's point, was that isn't it nice to be working in a language that supports both? So all these different styles are able to work. Some companies kind of insist everybody uses at least type checked just to make it easier. I always think that if you try to put in things in the language to prevent bad coders from writing bad code, you will ultimately fail. You can't stop bad coders from writing bad code. You just have to have test cases and make sure that things are working, so that or make sure that you have some way of knowing that things are working when you.
Yeah. I think there are many arguments given for why one is better than the other, particularly as far as type checking is better than dynamic stuff. Like, oh, you need more testing. Well, you don't really need more testing. You should have those tests anyway. But there are certain classes of error that the compiler can pick up that around types. And largely, developers are working with known types. So it makes sense to have that information available. But you can't do the markup builder stuff with known types. I think Scala can probably do it, but yeah, let's not go into that discussion.
Well, that's the sort of thing I run into all the time on the No Fluff Just Stuff tour. I've got other speakers on the tour who are Scala fans and some who are Clojure fans, and of course the Clojure fans want everything to be dynamic, and the Scala fans are like, no, everything should be static, and I try to stay out of the discussion.
Yeah. I think that's best, generally speaking. It's great having the option. I will stick to dynamic. I mean, I started adding @compile static to everything in Lazybones, and then it didn't seem to make a significant impact in the size of the class files or in the memory usage, and certainly didn't have any impact on the speed. So I decided just to remove it.
The other nice thing, as long as we're talking about testing a little bit, is that you may have noticed that at Manning, that book, Java Testing Using Spock, is actually in the top 10 of the the Manning Early Access Program bestsellers at the moment. Just look now; it's still sitting there at number 1. Java Testing with Spock by, now I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Konstantinos Kapolonis. I mean, it's a Greek name, so it looks pretty. It's usually pronounced how it looks. So I'm guessing that's how you say it.
Yeah, sorry, I missed that. You went muted almost.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to. What I was saying is that
Kapolonis. Yeah, that's probably how you pronounce it. So that's great for him. Because I mean, I don't recognize his name. I think it's suspect he's the author. So that's really great for him to have sort of number 1 in the MEEP.
Well, and I like the fact, again, that something from the Groovy ecosystem is bubbling up that high in popularity.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I've read through it a bit. It's, we've mostly just the first few chapters are available. It's going to be a while, but I like the fact that people have already jumped on the bandwagon and said, wow, this is going to be a good contribution. We've kind of needed a Spock book for many, many years. I have some Spock stuff in my book, but it's just a chapter. I'm sure there's throughout Groovy in action, I imagine. So it's nice to see a dedicated book that appears to be appealing to people outside the direct Groovy community. So I imagine that's the Java in the title again.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the bigger market is Java developers rather than necessarily the Groovy developers. So anything that sort of gets Groovy better known, and of course. What was I going to say? Really better known, and just gets it used in projects.
One last thing, just moving on. The last thing that I put in the show notes was about Cedric Champeau's blog post on Who is Groovy. Did you get a chance to look at that at all, by the way?
No, I've only just seen it.
The title, I think, was not indicative of what you were going to see there necessarily. I think you had to look at it to go, oh, is that what this is about? It's about the commit history of the language and how he showed certain people being very high on the commit list in terms of number of commits in the language itself and how that changed over time. I love the section called The Rise of Paul King, for example, where suddenly he's got a huge percentage of the commits. But the interesting thing, in addition to the blog post just being kind of fascinating as it was, the most interesting thing about it, of course, is it showed how many commits were being done by people who were not sponsored in any way to work on the language. Notably Paul, among others, have made a huge contribution. So that when people say, well, what about the pivotal support going away? Is this going to hurt? You point out, look, this is a very active language with people all over the world who are committing on a regular basis. That's not going to change in any way. But it was really fun to read that list. I do recommend that if you get a chance to read through it. It's, I mean, you're obviously in there. There's a lot of good stuff.
Well, I'm just trying to find myself in here. That's all I'm interested in. Is my name in here?
It's like Googling yourself. I gotta say, my one commit to the Groovy language actually made it in there. And I have to tell you a quick story about that. Is that what happened was I was looking at Groovelets. You remember Groovelets?
I do, yes.
Yeah, been a while. And when Groovelets were first created, they had a markup builder built into them that you could just use directly. And I was noticing, and this is probably 3 years ago or so, that it only had a markup builder built in. Why not also put in a JSON builder? So I went and in fact, this is all your fault. I got to tell you that.
Okay.
Yeah, you wrote a blog post. Yeah, you wrote a blog post back in about 2012, I recall, on how to contribute to the language. Describing the process, how you clone it, how you write your tests, and how you write the. It was as much a GitHub tutorial, a Git tutorial, as it was how to do this.
Yeah. I remember doing that.
Yeah, and I was in the middle of writing my book, and I'm like, well, geez, I don't at least commit something, you know. And by the way, to speak about how nice people are in the Groovy community, I once said to Jeff Brown that I felt like I ought to be a committer. I had to contribute something, not a committer, just a contributor. And he said, you're already a contributor. Don't worry about it, which is, again, just very nice of him. But at any rate, when I saw your blog post, I thought, okay, I'm going to contribute something. So I put in the JSON builder inside of Groovelets, and I wrote a test, a unit test, and it all worked. And then I committed it, and then to my horror discovered that I had contributed something and then broken the build in the process. Because it turned out that if you do the full integration build, it had to compile the Java stuff before the Groovy stuff or something like that. And also Guillaume pointed out, this really should be a streaming JSON builder rather than a regular JSON builder. But anyway, he fixed it. But it was, I had never realized to that point that you could feel elation and horror pretty much at the same time, you know? And you don't. You actually oscillate between them really quickly. It's like, oh, this is wonderful. I can't believe I did this. And oh my God, I can't believe I did this. I was horrified and go back and forth and back and forth. So, I mean, it was very generous of Cedric to include me on that list, but that's my one contribution, which at least I got a story out of it.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. Well, I think it's sort of just highlighting the numbers. I'm impressed that, the 2014?
Yes.
66 contributors he's
right. I mean, it's really grown enormously in the last few years. And again, Groovy's a quiet technology. It doesn't get the press. It doesn't show up as often, and yet it's becoming more and more widely adopted, quite pervasive.
Yeah.
Anything else you're interested in talking about? Anything that you've seen? I don't think we have anything else in the show notes at the moment.
Well, you missed the first item.
I did. Oh, my goodness, I did, didn't I?
That was a little surprise. So Guillaume Laforge, head of this sort of project lead for Groovy, has joined a new company, Restlet. Well, I don't know if Restlet itself is new, but no, I don't know. He must have moved very recently.
Yeah, well, Restlet is actually a technology that's been established for quite some time. I have friends who are very active in the RESTful web services area, things like semantic web and things. I mean, the really, the people they call Restafarians, if you will. And they've never been wild about any of the Java solutions, or implementations, I should say, of RESTful web services. They didn't have much fondness for JAX-RS or anything like that. At least Grails now supports hypermedia to some degree. Well, one of the APIs in Java that they generally did like, that they thought was a very nice approach, was restlets. And I had heard about it, and I kept expecting it to become bigger, but it's another one of those that just didn't seem to get the publicity for some reason. So I'm not terribly surprised Guillaume found a home. I mean, Guillaume's going to go somewhere, if you need an outstanding developer, he's your guy. But it's nice to see he goes to a place where obviously he'll be implementing everything with a nice Groovy API on top of it, and hopefully they will give him the time and support he needs to continue to work on the language, at least at some level, if not the level he used to.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly from the interview sounded as if he was going to be able to keep his Groovy hat on, as he said.
Yeah, because, I mean, he's been the head of the project, for over 10 years now? I don't know. He's been there for a while, so I think he was involved in the project close to the beginning. Yeah, you'll see him on the commit list right in there. He took over after. How do you pronounce his name? James Strahan. I don't know how you say it.
As far as I know, it's James Strachan.
Strachan. Yeah. Once he left, then that's when Guillaume took over. I think he's done a wonderful job. But yeah, now he's at Restlets, or the company behind Restlets. I don't know if the company has the same name. That's always dicey when you get into that problem, because then there's always trademark and copyright issues, and who wants to own the company wants to own the name of the company. What happens to the name of the product? You get all those issues there. But regardless, Guillaume is now there. I think the company is
Restlet.
Pardon me?
I think the company is Restlet.
Right, but regardless, Guillaume is now there, and that seems fine. What I find also interesting is conspicuous by its absence is any announcement from anybody else on that Groovy or Grails team that was at Pivotal.
Yeah, yeah. So fingers crossed for Cedric and Jochen and the Grails team, but it does seem that there's no one going to take the whole team. Um, but that was one of the kind of advantages of going for a foundation.
Well,
Uh,
and Paul is at his cert, so he'll be fine. So as long as he's there, there'll be commits. So, I mean, it's an interesting fact that he chose Wrestlitz. I think the description sounded like they're very happy to have him, and he's very happy to be there, and he will continue to work on the language as well as providing a nice groovy API on Wrestlitz. So I think it's all good in the end.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, sort of getting any company involvement into Groovy is a good thing. So let's say fingers crossed for the rest of the team. I'm pretty sure they should find new homes.
Okay, now anything else you can think of, or did we cover everything and I didn't miss the number one item?
No. I think we're well done for today. And hopefully there'll be more stuff to cover in a couple of weeks' time.
I have no doubt.
Hopefully I'll be clean shaven and recovered in 2 weeks.
Well, no, that you got that. What's the actor, the transporter? You got that thing.
Jason Statham. No. This is turning into a full-fledged beard. He just has stubble.
Yeah, but you've got a particular set of skills too. If you want to blend that in, so it's all good. It's all good.
Except I don't think I've got that London accent. I hope I don't.
So let's plan tentatively to try to do this again in another couple of weeks.
Yes.
And we'll see how you're feeling and everything. And I'm sure there'll be plenty to talk about in the Groovy ecosystem. So thank you very much for managing to, well, basically survive.
and not coughing all over the place.
Well, this is one time I'm glad I'm doing this via video. Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And thanks to everyone for listening, and hopefully we'll catch you next time. So goodbye.
Goodbye. I'll just stop the broadcast, right?
Yep.
Yep.